The neighborhood seemed ordinary, the kind of place where children rode their bikes in circles on summer afternoons and neighbors waved politely before disappearing back into their homes. Every house looked lived in, with trimmed lawns, cars parked neatly in driveways, and flower beds that showed signs of care. All except one. At the edge of the cul-de-sac stood a two-story house that seemed untouched by time. Its curtains were always drawn, its front door always closed, and no matter what season passed, nothing about it changed. Neighbors whispered that someone lived there, but no one ever saw them. The lawn grew uneven, the mailbox overflowed with old envelopes, and the windows reflected nothing but shadows. At first, no one questioned it. In quiet communities, it wasn't unusual for people to value privacy. Some assumed the owner was elderly, too frail to come outside. Others believed the house was rented out to someone who worked long hours. When the lights inside flickered on late at night and then vanished by morning, it gave just enough proof that someone was there. But weeks turned into months, and eventually, the house's stillness became impossible to ignore. The first sign that something was wrong came on a warm afternoon in early summer. A neighbor watering his plants noticed a strange smell drifting across the street. It was faint at first, easy to dismiss as garbage left out too long or an animal that had died somewhere nearby. But over the days that followed, the odor grew stronger, spreading through the block until people began keeping their windows shut. Children who once played near the house avoided the sidewalk in front of it. Conversations at backyard fences turned into uneasy theories about what could be happening inside. Despite the unease, no one wanted to be the first to make a call. It felt intrusive, like accusing someone of something terrible without proof. The community clung to explanations that made sense. Maybe a pipe had burst, maybe the smell came from the sewers, maybe someone inside was simply ill. Still, the longer it went on, the harder it was to deny that something sinister was festering behind the closed curtains. Mail continued to pile up at the door, spilling from the box and scattering across the porch in the wind. Flyers from local businesses, unopened utility bills, and handwritten letters lay untouched. The house seemed to repel anyone who came close, its silence pressing down like an invisible barrier. Even delivery drivers avoided walking up to the porch, choosing instead to leave packages at the very edge of the steps. The house was no longer just quiet. It was abandoned by life, yet strangely alive in its suffocating presence. The smell became unbearable on a particularly hot day when the sun lingered over the cul-de-sac until evening. Neighbors couldn't escape it no matter where they stood. That was when one woman, tired of waiting and too disturbed to ignore it any longer, picked up her phone and dialed the police. Her voice shook as she explained the situation, admitting she wasn't even sure what she wanted them to find. All she knew was that something inside that house was wrong, and the people who lived around it could no longer pretend otherwise. By the time the call ended, the neighborhood's uneasy curiosity had shifted into dread. For years, the house had been nothing more than a shadow at the edge of their routine. Now it had become something else entirely, a mystery about to be cracked open with an answer none of them were prepared to face. When the officers pulled up to the quiet street, the cul-de-sac looked as peaceful as any other afternoon. Children's toys were scattered across a neighbor's lawn, and the faint hum of a lawnmower drifted from a few houses away. Everything looked normal, except for the house they had been called to check. Its stillness set it apart from its surroundings, as though it didn't belong in the same world as the rest of the neighborhood. The blinds were drawn tight, and the front steps were littered with envelopes and flyers curling under the heat. The officers approached cautiously, not yet sure what they were walking into. The first knock echoed through the air like a hollow drum. There was no movement, no shuffle of feet, no muffled voice from behind the door. They knocked again, harder this time, waiting in silence. Even the usual background noises of a home, the faint buzz of a television, the bark of a dog, the hum of an air conditioner, were absent. The house seemed to be holding its breath, daring them to push further. A third knock came, sharp and commanding, but the result was the same, nothing. With each passing second, the smell leaking from the house grew more unbearable. The officers exchanged tense glances before circling the property. The backyard was just as unkempt as the front, weeds curling around the fence, grass overgrown and brittle underfoot. The windows were shut tight, some sealed with boards that had clearly been nailed from the inside. Every detail heightened their unease. Whoever had lived here wanted to be shut away from the world completely. Returning to the front door, they announced themselves once more, giving a final chance for anyone inside to answer. The silence pressed harder now, almost suffocating. With no response, one officer forced the lock and the door gave way with a groan. The smell rushed out in a suffocating wave strong enough to make their eyes water. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, clinging to their skin like damp cloth. The entryway was surprisingly tight. Shoes lined up against the wall, a coat neatly hung on a rack, a family photo still framed and standing on a small table. Nothing about it looked abandoned, yet there was an eerie stillness, as though the house had been paused in time. Moving deeper inside, they found rooms that were unnervingly spotless. The kitchen counters were wiped clean, dishes stacked neatly, and the refrigerator humming faintly in the corner. It was the kind of order that felt deliberate, unnatural. Every surface seemed wiped of life, as though someone had tried to erase their own existence. Upstairs, a single door stood locked. Unlike the others, which opened easily into sterile bedrooms and bare closets, this door resisted. Its handle was scratched, the wood dented as though it had been kicked from the other side. The officers lingered in the hallway, the silence pressing in closer with every second. They could feel that the answers they sought were behind that door, waiting for them, rotting in the dark. The house had given them no signs of life, but its secrets were there, just beyond the barrier. The decision to break it open was not taken lightly, but hesitation in that moment only deepened the dread. The officers prepared themselves, unaware that forcing open that locked door would mark the moment when a routine welfare check turned into the beginning of the worst discovery of their lives. The sound of the door giving way echoed through the narrow hallway, splintering the silence into something raw and unsettling. The officers stepped into the room cautiously, their flashlights sweeping across the space. At first glance, it looked like the kind of bedroom that belonged to a child years ago and had been frozen in place ever since. The walls were covered with faded drawings, crayon sketches taped haphazardly, but carefully preserved. Some showed houses, others smiling faces, and a few were scribbled so frantically that the shapes were unrecognizable. The bed was perfectly made, the sheets stretched tight as if untouched for years. On the dresser, a line of stuffed animals sat upright, their button eyes staring blankly into the dim light. Dust covered every surface, yet the arrangement felt intentional, almost staged. Nothing was out of place, but nothing felt real either. It was as if the room had been created to mimic the memory of a child rather than serve an actual one. The officer's attention was drawn to the far corner, where a large trunk sat chained shut. The smell, now overwhelming, seemed to seep directly from it. The trunk's surface was scarred and dented, the padlocks heavy and new compared to the aged furniture around it. Whoever had locked it wanted it to stay sealed. Cutting through the chains was difficult, and with every strike of the bolt cutters, tension thickened in the air. When the final lock snapped free, the trunk creaked open. Inside, the first layer was almost harmless. Dozens of photographs lay scattered in neat stacks. Each picture showed a child, some smiling, some with blank stares, others caught mid-play in parks and schoolyards. What made them horrifying was recognition. Several of the faces matched children who had been reported missing from surrounding towns over the past decade. The photographs weren't random. They were trophies organized and cataloged with sick precision. Beneath the photographs lay small belongings, tiny shoes, each pair tied together, hair ribbons, bracelets, and jackets folded neatly as though they belonged in a dresser, not locked away in a trunk. Each item was labeled with a piece of tape marked with initials and dates. The officers realized they weren't just looking at keepsakes, they were staring at evidence of lives stolen and cataloged like specimens. Digging deeper into the trunk revealed something even more chilling. A worn notebook sat at the bottom, its pages filled with careful handwriting. It wasn't a diary in the traditional sense, but a record. Each entry corresponded to a child, describing where they were last seen, how they had been taken, and what had been done to them afterward. The language was clinical, detached, as if the writer saw these children as nothing more than projects. The room itself now seemed to transform in their eyes. The drawings weren't innocent, they were staged. The toys weren't playthings, they were props. The space had been designed to preserve a fantasy, a shrine to innocence that had been stolen and twisted. The officers stood frozen, the reality of what they had uncovered pressing down on them. This was no ordinary case. They weren't inside the home of a reclusive neighbor. They were inside the carefully constructed lair of someone who had built an entire life around secrets too horrific to imagine. One of the officers lingered near the staircase as the others combed through the upstairs rooms. Something about the lower level felt unfinished, as if the house itself was urging them to look deeper. A faint draft brushed against the officer's legs near the wall, carrying with it an odor that was even sharper than what they had encountered upstairs. When he leaned down, he noticed a small seam in the wood paneling beneath the stairs. It wasn't just storage, it was an entrance, cleverly disguised and wedged into the very structure of the home. The hidden door creaked as it opened, revealing a narrow flight of steps leading into darkness. The officers hesitated, their flashlights piercing only a fraction of the descent. The air grew colder with every step downward, but the stench grew stronger, curling into their lungs and making their stomachs twist. The basement floor spread out into a maze of concrete chambers, far larger than the house above should have allowed. It wasn't just a cellar. It was something deliberately constructed, hidden from the eyes of anyone who might have visited. The first chamber they entered was small and bare, except for heavy chains bolted into the ground and the wall. The links were thick, rusted from use, and the floor beneath them bore scratches as though someone had once fought desperately against their restraints. Nearby, a thin mattress lay crumpled in the corner, its surface stained and torn. The silence of the room screamed louder than any noise, whispering of suffering that had happened there in the dark. Moving deeper into the basement, they found another chamber, this one cluttered with makeshift furniture. A rickety table stood in the center, covered in notebooks, maps, and newspaper clippings. The notebooks were filled with more detailed accounts than the ones upstairs, each entry coldly documenting the capture of children, their routines, and the precautions taken to keep them hidden. The handwriting remained disturbingly neat, suggesting that whoever had written them took pride in their precision. Pinned to the walls were missing persons flyers collected from various towns, some of them yellowed and curling with age. Red circles had been drawn around faces as though marking targets on a list. In one corner sat an old tape recorder, surrounded by a pile of cassette tapes labeled with dates. The officers didn't dare play them yet, but the implication alone was enough to make their skin crawl. At the far end of the basement, they came upon something even more chilling. The largest chamber was divided into smaller cells with crude concrete partitions. Each cell contained a bed, a bucket, and a single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were scratched with marks, some random, some carved numbers as though someone had tried to track the days. The cells radiated despair, each corner filled with silent echoes of captivity. The deeper the officers went, the more it became clear that the house above had been nothing more than a mask. The real story of this place existed underground, hidden in the suffocating concrete walls. It was not just a home, it was a prison, a workshop, and a graveyard of secrets. And yet, even as they took in the horror of what lay before them, they had a gnawing sense that they still hadn't uncovered the worst of it. Somewhere in this underground labyrinth, something far darker was waiting to be found. The officers had already seen enough to know the basement was more than a hidden chamber of secrets, but something about the far wall drew their attention. Unlike the rough concrete that surrounded the other rooms, this section looked newer, the plaster lighter and smoother, as though someone had recently tried to hide what lay behind it. The surface seemed to almost shine under the glow of their flashlights, betraying its purpose as a cover-up rather than a structural necessity. The uneasy silence between them confirmed what they all felt. Whatever was behind that wall was the final piece of this nightmare. They fetched tools from the patrol car and returned to break through. The first strike of the sledgehammer sent cracks racing across the plaster. Dust filled the air, clinging to their throats and stinging their eyes. With each blow, the smell intensified, swelling until it was almost unbearable. The wall gave way slowly, revealing a narrow crawl space beyond, its low ceiling forcing them to crouch as they entered. The beam of the first flashlight cut through the darkness, and what it revealed froze them where they stood. The crawl space was filled with remains. Some were skeletons, carefully arranged in rows as if laid out with intention. Others were still clothed, the fabric decayed but recognizable, shoes and small accessories still clinging to what was left of them. Each figure had been placed deliberately, positioned with eerie care. It wasn't chaos or neglect, it was ritual. Whoever had done this had turned the crawl space into a gallery of death. Personal items were scattered among the bodies. Tiny backpacks, worn stuffed animals, and notebooks filled with childish handwriting rested beside skeletal forms. The placement of these objects suggested they weren't simply discarded. They were meant to be displayed. It was a grotesque shrine to innocence stolen, each arrangement telling a silent story of lives interrupted and identities erased. One officer's flashlight landed on a section at the farthest end of the crawl space. Here, the remains were more recent, the clothing still intact, the skin not yet fully gone. It was undeniable evidence that this nightmare had continued until very recently. The reality struck them like a physical blow. The person responsible hadn't stopped years ago. They had been active, perhaps even while neighbors lived their quiet lives just steps away. The weight of the discovery pressed heavily on the officers. The notebooks upstairs, the chains in the basement, the cells, and now this hidden tomb, it all painted a single horrific picture. The house wasn't simply a place of residence. It was a carefully constructed trap designed to capture, contain, and erase children without a trace. The meticulous order of the display showed pride, as if the killer saw this as an accomplishment rather than a crime. When they finally emerged from the crawl space, covered in dust and shaken to their core, the once quiet house above felt like a shell, a deceptive mask hiding the truth beneath. The neighborhood would never look the same again. The people who had once wondered why the house stayed so silent now had their answer, and it was darker than anything they could have imagined. For the officers, the memory of what they had uncovered would never leave them. This was no longer just another call. It was the worst discovery of their lives, one that would haunt them long after the house was emptied and the evidence cataloged.